Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. This is kind of a special week. It is, in fact, Salinger Week. We started with a very close, very in-depth look at Franny, which is, of course, the first part of Franny and Zooey. We are now going to take a very close look at the short story, the first short story in 9 stories, called A Perfect Day for Bananafish. We will then wrap up Salinger Week with a third installment, which will be a very close look, well, probably not as close a look as Franny, but we're going to take a close look at Zooey, and we are also going to take a look at the way that the two pieces of Franny and Zooey speak to each other, the ways that they echo each other and develop each other. So first was Franny, next is Bananafish, and we will finish up with Franny and Zooey. Some of you are probably thinking, like, why are we reading the short story in between Franny and Zooey? And the reason is that I would argue that Seymour Glass, who is at the center of the story, A Perfect Day for Bananafish, Seymour becomes this very important character for the Glass family. In fact, in all of the lore, he is a very important person. And he is extremely important in Zooey. So I wanted to take a look before we arrive at Zooey, which has to do with both Franny and Zooey. And it has to do with the way that Franny has had this religious crisis. We saw the beginning of it in Franny, and we will see the continuation of it in Zooey. But it has a lot to do with Seymour. It's also going to be so cool because in some ways it is really echoing a lot of what we looked at in Franny, and it's going to introduce some ideas that we will see in Zooey. So I'm really actually very pleased with the way that the curriculum this week is turning out. The agenda, for those of you who like an agenda, we're going to look very briefly at the timeline of publication and Salinger's life. I did a more exhaustive thing about Salinger's life in the Franny installment, so if you're dying to hear more about Salinger's life, you should check that out. Also, to be clear, a lot of the information just comes straight from Wikipedia. I also, by the way, I made a mistake. On Monday, during the Franny lecture, I said that he enlisted in the Army in 1946. He was, in fact, drafted into the Army. And the other important thing is that he had been treated for battle fatigue, which is today, we would think of that as post-traumatic stress syndrome. And part of that treatment was, in fact, a psychiatric evaluation that diagnosed this battle fatigue. And then did the counterintelligence work. It's this process of denazification, which sounds just absolutely terrible. And he took part in that and, in fact, liberated a group of people from Dachau, which became, a sort of a seminal event for him. I mean, it's not, he doesn't talk about it directly, but in many ways you can see that as a very important event in his personal life. So we're going to take a look at the timeline there. Then we're going to take a look at similarities, just very briefly and very broadly, at similarities between the story Franny and A Perfect Day for Bananafish. We're then going to move through the story, which is so fun. It's so cool if we have a short little story like this. It's only 23 pages. We can really dig into it pretty carefully. We can sort of really comprehend the whole thing. And we'll end with we'll end with the end of the short story, but we'll also end with some concluding thoughts about Seymour and Buddy and about how Zooey is going to unfold. One more very important clarification that I realized in some of the sleuthing, some of the researching that I was doing about Bananafish is that I was thinking of the right hand and the left hand in very kind of European terms, and in this idea of the siniestro, which is this long tradition of sort of the sinister, and the left hand as being el siniestro. Like you have like the left bank, that idea of left as being kind of lesser and somewhat evil, in fact. But I think we need to understand all of this hand stuff that we see in Franny, and we see again in Bananafish, and then certainly we see it in Zooey. The emphasis on the left hand has to do with a Zen Buddhist concept about how the left hand is really the hand, the left-handed path is really the path and the hand that has to do with wisdom and enlightenment and spirituality. The right hand is more associated with action and with organized religion. So this was a bit of a mind blower for me. Really, what I realized here is that I was reading this, in fact, in a very kind of Western European set of contexts when in fact I needed to literally expand my horizons and take in a bit more of the Zen Buddhist thing, which was in fact very important to Salinger during the 1940s when he was writing this. that is the perfect segue into our very brief look at the timeline. So he was born in 1919, January 1st, in fact, 1919, which is very handy while I'm trying, valiantly to calculate the math here. In 1941, he submitted his first story to the New Yorker. He was 22 years old. I'm now worried about my math, but I think I did that correctly. In 1942, when he was 23 years old, he was drafted into the Army. He did not, in fact, enlist. In 1946, he had his first publication in the New Yorker. On Monday, in the Franny lecture, I made it sound like Bananafish was his first publication in the New Yorker, and it is not. And I actually knew that, but I realized in listening to the edit that, in fact, I made it sound like that. It's called Slight Rebellion off Madison, and it is in many ways sort of the germ of what will grow to be Catcher in the Rye. So that's 1946, his first ever published New Yorker story. Part of the reason that is significant is because that is also the year that he is discharged from the Army. In 1945, which was toward the very end of his career in the Army, is when he did this denazification and, in fact, liberated part of Dachau. He came home from the Second World War having married a German woman named Sylvia Welter. The reason it bears mention here, I believe, is that we have to think a little bit about Bananafish, which in fact was published in 1948, so a couple years later. We have to look at the story, I think, a little bit in terms of the breakdown of Salinger's marriage. So he comes back in 1946 with battle fatigue that is significant. He brings Sylvia back to the United States. She was only here for 8 months. Clearly, this is a marriage that was very difficult in many ways. So the reason why I'm emphasizing that is that we have to look at that in terms of A Perfect Day for Bananafish. It is in 1947 that he submits a story called Bananafish. It is not published until 1948 as A Perfect Day for Bananafish. You will recall from before that Franny is published in 1955, Zooey is published in 1957, and the volume of the two of them together is in 1961. So it is 7 years before Franny that we see the publication of Bananafish. The reason I am emphasizing that is there are grains, they're little germs of both Franny and Zooey that I think are very clear in this first story. It doesn't feel repetitive. It doesn't feel like he's kind of recycling information. In fact, it just feels rich and pretty amazing. We are now moving on to our quick section about all of the similarities that we see in Franny. So if you read the two back to back, these will be fairly obvious to you, but it's really fun for me actually to pull these things out of Franny, which we just looked at somewhat exhaustively in our first Salinger Week lecture. So one of the things that we see right at the beginning of Franny is that mention of Rilke, who is an Austrian poet who was writing in German, who really had a lot of difficulties in World War I, suffered from a lot of depression and anxiety, a lot of the same things that we see in a lot of characters of Salinger. So Rilke is not named in Bananafish, but you see him, you see Seymour recommending Rilke. I'm assuming it's Rilke. I might be wrong. I could be wrong about that. But in my heart, it is Rilke, in fact, that he is recommending to his wife. His wife, in fact, does not read German, so she's not understanding Rilke. But as the reader, and in fact, no one's understanding Rilke in Franny either. As the reader, it's very satisfying if you know anything about Rilke. And I think a lot of people, back in the day, we all read Letters to a Young Poet. In fact, they always have it at like Anthropology and, those kinds. It's actually out in a very beautiful cover, which is to say that Rilke is really very accessible in lots of ways and really speaks to the youth and is very emotional. He's very sort of mystic in lots of ways, but was a very important touchstone for Salinger. And we see him in both of the very beginning, in fact, of both of these collections, 9 Stories and Franny and Zooey. All throughout Franny and all throughout the beginning of 9 Stories, we have tons of smoking. We have lots and lots of attention paid to cigarettes and ashtrays. If you would like, and I think a Freudian interpretation here is appropriate, because even in Bananafish, which is, again, from 1948, we have a lot of discussion of Freud and psychoanalysis. So, I think the idea of looking for phallic and vaginal symbols is not maybe uncalled for. That's a very Salinger sort of construction to say that is not uncalled for. We discussed that on Monday, you'll remember. Lots of cigarettes and lots of ashtrays is typical of the era, but the attention paid to these phallic and vaginal symbols is important. Okay, we also in both cases have a very confident young woman. In the case of Muriel, who is in Bananafish, she is very confident. She's very kind of blasé. She is just spending her sunburnt midday in the hotel, painting her fingernails, smoking cigarettes, not rushing to answer the phone. And in Franny, we see also a very confident woman. Because she is in crisis, you kind of lose track of the fact that she is, in fact, very confident. She's very honest with Lane about the fact that he sounds like a section man, and she is critical of a lot of different people, but she's also self-aware enough to know that she's being critical. All of that has to stem from a decent amount of confidence. Also, both of these women, Muriel and Franny, are seen as romantic partners with men. So, of course, Lane is basically a foil for all of the Glass men and is just sort of we have some sympathy for him, and I actually have quite a bit of sympathy for him. But you get the sense that he stands for everything that the Glasses do not believe in. In the case of Muriel, she is obviously Seymour's wife. We don't really know. You get the sense in A Perfect Day for Bananafish that they're on a honeymoon. That is not, in fact, correct. It's kind of like a honeymoon because, in fact, they were separated so long during the war, but they have actually been married for some time, which we don't know until later Salinger stories. But again, you have a young woman who is romantically involved with a young man. So we see that in both Bananafish and in Franny. There's lots of stuff with left hands. These are people who are not left-handed, as far as we know. But again, this idea of the left hand as being this path towards spiritual awakening is important. In both cases, we have this notion of returning home. So in Bananafish, which is first, we see this young woman, Muriel, who is really determined not to come home. Her parents didn't want her to take this trip. She's having this conversation with her mother saying, we want you to come home. Are you sure you don't want to come home? Which is interesting because she has been married for 6 years, but home presumably means their home. She has likely been spending the war with them. And so you have this sense of her being sort of encouraged to return to the family fold. And in fact, Muriel is like, no, I haven't had a vacation in 6 years. I, in fact, would really like to, enjoy this time in Florida. So you have this idea of Muriel as not wanting to return home. You also kind of eerily have this idea that is what she would likely do after her husband takes his life. So at the end of the story, he in fact shoots himself in a really terrible, terrible way. Muriel is in fact in the same room. So you have a sense that she will in fact return home. With Franny, it's obviously very important because she returns home in order to have her religious crisis in, this sort of very important familial context, and also with the support of her mother in lots of ways. So there is this idea of young women who are just beginning to sort of leave the fold and are both brought back into the family circle. We have snobbery in both. So with Franny, she's very judgy about everyone. Certainly, she understands that these people also deserve compassion. But for people like Wally, who's off in Europe for the summer or whatever, she just really has no patience for him. And in fact, she's very snobby in a kind of anti-intellectual way with Lane. We see a lot more kind of overt snobbery in A Perfect Day for Bananafish. And we're going to talk about it because it seems kind of off-putting and ugly, but I will argue that in lots of ways, Muriel's snobbery and her judginess and her kind of triviality, and, she's concerned about clothes and she's concerned about the size of another woman's hips and like a decent amount of really judgy kind of disparaging remarks. But I will argue that worldliness, that idea of her as being very concerned with things that are very terrestrial and not really very important, and certainly not, spiritual and not intellectual, that is very important for Seymour. So in many ways, you get the sense, we're going to look at this, you get the sense that they actually have kind of a nice relationship, and you certainly get the feeling that Muriel in lots of ways is kind of tethering him to the earth. So both of them have snobbery, but it sort of functions in different ways. In fact, in terms of snobbery, we have this very sort of touching and I think very important echo and very kind of obvious thing at the very end of the story that speaks to the intimacy and the fondness, really, that Seymour has for his wife. He's out with Sybil in the ocean. "Here comes a wave," Sybil said nervously. "We'll ignore it. We'll snub it," said the young man. "Two snobs." So here we have this idea of him as sort of embracing the idea of snobbery and of snubbing things. So you have the idea of him being able to take that sort of thing lightly and even to have an appreciation for it. And in fact, to have that sort of be the thing that's going to help you overcome the wave. So I think we can read that all as somewhat of an elevation of the judgy snobbery that Muriel and her mother are both exhibiting. In both cases, A Perfect Day for Bananafish and in Franny, we have quite a few references to psychoanalysis. In Franny, which is, again, the later story, we have these overt references to Freud. So there is this kind of preoccupation in some ways with the psychoanalytic, which I, of course, really enjoy. Most importantly, in both, we have this crazy lack of communication. We're going to look at it very closely in A Perfect Day for Bananafish. There's so many different ways that communication is not happening. And in fact, they are very similar to the ways that Franny and Lane are failing to communicate in Franny, and then also the ways in Zooey that Zooey will have a hard time communicating with his brother, with his mother, and certainly with Franny herself. So on that note, this is, again, a perfect segue. When we think of the ways in which Bananafish is going to inform the collection Franny and Zooey together, there's some really important things. One is the structure. So in Bananafish, we have a first part that is told from the perspective of Muriel. And then the second part is very closely following Seymour. And we have that exact same structure again when Salinger and his publishers decide to put Franny and Zooey, a short story and a novella, into one collection. I really like it. I really love the way that this short story and the novella kind of play off of each other and develop each other and echo each other and plant seeds for each other. But I also think it's really interesting just to note the structural similarities between Bananafish and the collection Franny and Zooey. In both cases, Buddy acts as a sort of narrator. So we don't really have him. If you just read Bananafish and none of the rest of Salinger, you wouldn't really know this. But later we find out that Buddy is sort of this person who is telling all of the stories. It's not super explicit, and I'm not even sure that in 1948 and 47 and 46 that Salinger is really like thinking about this question of who is in fact narrating all of these Glass family stories. It turns out, in fact, that Buddy is a writer. Buddy is a writer who, in fact, sounds very much like Salinger. He has published one novel, and it happens to be about some sort of disaffected youth in New York City. So in many ways, I think we are meant to conflate Buddy and Salinger. So we know in Zooey, we're going to look at that next in the next lecture. It opens with Zooey reading a letter from Buddy. So in lots of ways, Buddy does this first-person narration in Zooey because we are reading the letter verbatim. So we're hearing a lot of Buddy's voice. And in some ways, once you know that, you can hear his voice also in Bananafish. But also kind of the perfect like absence of him because it also reads very much like a plain third-person narration. And then lastly, in both stories, we have a very strong presence of mothers. They're kind of ineffectual. They're not really like helping. They're not sort of, they're not the main players. They aren't the main catalyst, but they both provide these very important sort of safety nets that I think are very interesting in both cases. Okay, we're now getting to the very exciting part where we're going to dive into the text. As with all covers that are sort of no nonsense, we have this, a very plain title, 9 stories. I do think we can read into that 9 lives. There are a bunch of different things we can do with this idea. But for the most part, it's a very sort of unadorned title. And in fact, Salinger stipulated and was very controlling about his art on the front of all of his novels. And most of them, the sort of classic paperback, is just white with sometimes a little bit of color and just the title and his name. Okay, we're going to dig in. Our dedication here is to Dorothy Olding and Gus Lobrano. These are people who were, sort of the publishing world, along with William Shawn at The New Yorker. These were probably his people at Little Brown who helped with sort of the book side of things. And then we come to this very important Zen cone. So this is now very famous. I feel like this is a very kind of well-worn, concept or like trope almost that people bring up. I think it's come to stand in for Zen and in some ways ends up feeling sort of like a spoof of the kind of Zen concept. But it is this very famous cone. We know the sound of 2 hands clapping, but what is the sound of 1 hand clapping? I don't know actually that much about Zen Buddhism, but I do know one thing, which is that it's very kind of anti-intellectual. which fits right in with Salinger. It's very sort of anti-logic, meaning it's kind of post-human, although that's kind of a more new term. But this idea that, this is a very, very old religion. It is very non-Western in lots of ways. And so this idea of the Enlightenment and the idea of science and the idea even of like Aristotle and some of the Greek kind of logicians and Greek philosophers, it sort of is questioning a lot of the kind of basic philosophical things that we think of. It's really wanting to sort of go beyond what we know to be true, whether we're looking at philosophy or whether we're looking at science. So when we see this Zen cone idea, this idea of something that is kind of impossible or illogical and something that makes you think more, this beginning epigraph is really pushing us toward that kind of thought. Then we have our table of contents. A Perfect Day for Bananafish is, in fact, the very first story in the collection. Of course, when we are looking at a short story, we need to take a good look at the title. So A Perfect Day for Bananafish, this is one of these kind of well-trod terms. People say, hey, it's a perfect day for a picnic, or, it's a perfect day to take a drive. Take a drive, who says that? But in this case, we have this sort of shift that happens. A perfect day for sounds very, in lots of ways is very familiar, but then it ends with bananafish. So I would argue that bananafish is in fact very much like this Zen cone in that this is something that does not exist. At the end, we have Seymour telling Sybil what a bananafish is, and it is in fact very sad and tragic, but it is also something that is imaginary. It's something, the joining of two things in a way that is totally illogical and makes us think beyond, species of fruit and fish. So I think right at the beginning, we're meant to sort of take a normal phrase and then realize that Salinger is going to be pushing beyond. It's also important that it is a perfect day for, partly because that is the expression that everyone uses, but it's not the perfect day for whatever this thing is. It's a perfect day. And in this case, in other ways, it is the perfect day for Seymour Glass to take his own life. So, which is a really sad and terrible way to interpret it, but I think it is unavoidable, certainly after your first reading of the story. I also like the fact that he says these exact words to Sybil. He says it's a perfect day for bananafish, and I love that. I always love it when an author pulls a sentence directly from a story. But it is important that this is Seymour's voice. We do not, during the entire saga of the Glass family, we do not hear a lot of things directly from Seymour. But his conversation with Sybil is one of the places where we do hear his voice. And in fact, this is something he himself is saying. A perfect day for bananafish. Okay, we're now going to dive into the novel. There were 97 New York advertising men in the hotel, and the way they were monopolizing the long-distance lines, the girl in 507 had to wait from noon till almost 2:30 to get her call through. I love this because what we have here is this third-person narrator. We say the girl, and in fact later when he's talking about Seymour, it's always the young man, emphasizing youth. So we have this third-person narrator, but as soon as you get a little way into the story, you recognize that these words and these observations are in fact Muriel's. And part of that is because the specificity and the exaggeration is something that Muriel would do. Muriel is a very entitled young woman, and she's not excited that, in fact, the 97 advertising men are in fact monopolizing the long distance lines. It's very important that at the beginning of the story here we have a long distance line. So this idea of communication and this preoccupation with the inability to communicate is present right from the beginning. So you have this idea of people being long distance. So right away communication is strained, but also we have these long distance telephone lines and they are in fact very congested. So even though we have them established, they are not helping us. And when we get to Zooey, we will see that the telephone in many different ways is extremely important. So the presence here at the beginning of the phone and these long distance lines and the conversation between Muriel and her mother is very important because there is a very important phone call in Zooey where we have that lack of communication brought even further to the fore. She used the time, though. She read an article in a women's pocket-sized magazine called Sex is Fun or Hell. She washed her comb and brush. She took the spot out of the skirt of her beige suit. She moved the button on her Saks blouse. She tweezed out 2 freshly surfaced hairs in her mole. When the operator finally rang her room, she was sitting on the window seat and had almost finished putting lacquer on the nails of her left hand. Couple of very important things here. So later on, Seymour makes mention when he is talking to Buddy about how Muriel wanted to play house, that domesticity was important to her. So very importantly, we have these two in the liminal space of a hotel. So a liminal space is simply something in literature where you have a place of transition. So it could be a hallway, it could be an airport terminal, it could be a doorway. Anytime you see someone in literature in a liminal space, certainly a hotel lobby, certainly, these are places where you're going to potentially see some sort of change, some sort of evolution. If you don't, then that is also important because this is someone who is sort of resisting evolution or change or transportation in all senses of that word. But here we have Muriel in this hotel and having arrived not long before and doing all of these very domestic things. I will also argue that Muriel is a very competent young woman. She is in this place. She's being productive. She's just no nonsense. She's using her time. She's very effective. It's very important, too, that she is reading an article about sex. Much is made about sex. Later, we find out in a different story that Muriel's mother is very angry because Seymour has not tried to seduce his daughter. So you do have this idea of impotence on the part of Seymour. It doesn't seem, it's not like a Hemingway thing where he is actually physically impotent. But you do get the sense that he's having such a hard time psychologically that he is not easy in his sexuality. And we have this dichotomy right away, sex is fun or hell. So we have this idea, also the introduction of hell and death, but we have this idea of extremes. And in Franny, we saw lots and lots of exaggeration, lots of hyperbole, which really spoke to the extreme state that Franny was in the beginning and that will continue in Zooey. You also get the sense that Muriel's kind of interested in sex, but also this introduction of the idea of sex as not maybe working very well between the two of them. We're going to go on now. I love this sentence so much. It's one of the sentences that I always remember about this story. She was a girl who for a ringing phone dropped exactly nothing. So there are a couple of things that are happening here. Of course, it's a beautiful way to say that she is entitled, that she's used to a lot of popularity. He goes on to say she looks like her phone never stopped ringing ever since she has reached puberty. But we also have this incredible grammatical thing happening that happens again and again. We're not going to look at all the instances, but lots of times, whether he's doing it with an em dash or commas or just with the phrasing of the sentence, Salinger will start something and then he'll suspend whatever that clause is going to be, and he'll make a small digression and then he will finish the rest of the sentence. So what we're having here, even grammatically, is the idea of communication as being interrupted and digression as being important. So this idea, she was a girl who, and then we have a prepositional phrase that is stuck in there, for a ringing phone dropped exactly nothing. So this idea of, if you wanted to sort of diagram the sentence, which I love to do, you could, in fact, take out that prepositional phrase, she was a girl who dropped exactly nothing. But this for a ringing phone both focuses us on that phrase, but also provides this kind of suspension. It happens again and again. It heightens our attention in terms of language. Because these sentences are a little tricky to read out loud, I literally had to read that last one so many times to get it right, which is weird. But in many ways, he's making language strange in order to sort of get our attention and in order to make it a little bit new. But there is also this thing of interrupting communication and having the communication with the reader feel a little frustrated and a little suspended in these very short bursts because, you're finding out in the sentence what happens. But it's a very cool thing that he is doing just with the syntax. Okay, I'm going to read on here. With her little lacquer brush, while the phone was ringing, she went over the nail of her little finger. Again, here we have that chunk in the middle, while the phone was ringing. And that's also adding some tension and some suspense for the reader. I mean, the phone is ringing. She's been waiting, for 2.5 hours in order to get this call. And yet she is now just sort of, very slowly finishing up her task. She then replaced the cap on the bottle of lacquer and, standing up, passed her left, the wet, hand back and forth through the air. So this is very important too. She's passing the hand through the air. She's not even waving it. You get this sense of everything as being very languorous. She's not in any rush. She's really, in many ways, very sort of settled and blasé about everything, which is pretty astonishing given the trajectory of the story. And also the fact that we know right from the beginning, not quite yet, but that her husband is, under some duress. And then we go on. With her dry hand, she picked up a congested ashtray from the window seat and carried it with her over to the night table on which the phone stood. She sat down on one of the made-up twin beds and, it was the 5th or 6th ring, picked up the phone. So we have this idea here of the twin beds, and they are made up. So, right from the beginning, we get this sense that things sexually are not going well for them. You could say, like, that doesn't mean anything. They could have had sex in one of the beds, and that is true. But if Salinger is pointing out the detail of these twin beds, we are definitely meant to believe, in fact, that they are not, their sex life is not going all that well. Very importantly, we need to think too about the absence of Seymour throughout this whole first section. The first section is longer. We actually have far more of Muriel and her mother than we do of Seymour. And it's also very important to recognize the fact that he is not here. He is absent. Muriel's having this conversation about him, but he is in fact absent. Okay, moving on. "Hello," she said, keeping the fingers of her left hand outstretched and away from her white silk dressing gown, which was all that she was wearing, except mules. Her rings were in the bathroom. So there's a lot of bridal stuff happening here. She's wearing a white dressing gown. We also find out in the latter half that Seymour is wearing a bathrobe on the beach. So they're basically wearing the same clothing, which I think is meant to help us kind of see them as united. We are also, though, meant to see her. She's not a bride. She hasn't just gotten married, and yet she is very bridal. We also have the very important detail of her rings being in the bathroom. The fact that she is not wearing her wedding band is very important. There is this sense of her marriage as not being intact, not being on her finger. Now that we have read and fairly closely analyzed the first, page, I'm going to run through a couple of things very quickly. We're going to just look at the evidence for a couple of these different points I want to make. One is the fact that no really successful communication is happening. And that is something we see in Franny, and it's something that we see in Zooey. And at the end of this little chunk of lecture about communication, I want to talk about the so what. But right here, we're going to just run through them fairly quickly. So we have the long distance lines. She's waiting from noon until 2:30 to get her call through. She is, in fact, a girl who, for a ringing phone, dropped exactly nothing. She's not even hurrying to communicate. Then we move on, and once she has her mother on the phone, we have this. Her mother says, "Why haven't you phoned?" And she says, "I tried to get you last night and the night before. The phone here's been... Are you all right, Muriel?" So here we have an interruption on the part of the mother, but we also understand that the phones have been congested, much like the ashtray. A little further down, the mother says, "Why haven't you called me? I've been worried to..." "Mother, darling, don't yell at me. I can hear you beautifully." First of all, she's interrupting her mother, who is very concerned about her. This is a story that's very tense. We have a lot of concern on the part of the mother, and so our tension, receptors are very aware of that. And then in the second part, we're worried about Sybil, we're worried about Seymour. It's a story, now that I have read it like 100 times, it doesn't feel that tense to me, but the first time you read it, it is in fact very tense. So we have this idea not only of Muriel interrupting her mother, but also this idea of "don't yell at me, I can hear you beautifully." But she's not, in fact, hearing her. And then a couple of pages later, we have this moment when Muriel asks her mother if the book of German poetry is kicking around, and the mother makes the point that that book is actually in the original German. So again, this is that kind of lack of communication. Seymour really wants her to understand this poet, who I'm assuming is Rilke, but it's in German. So those are ways in which Seymour is really, in fact, failing to communicate with his young wife. Then we have lots of things. There are lots of phrases back and forth, like things like, "Muriel, now listen to me." And then Muriel says, "I'm listening." And then they go on with a part of the conversation that doesn't have anything to do with listening or not listening. So they're even talking about the failure of communication. A little later, we have the idea of a psychiatrist in the hotel with them in Florida. And the mother says, "Tell me, did you talk to this psychiatrist?" And she says, "Well, sort of." So again, we have this idea of communication that almost works, but in fact does not. But importantly, right before we shift into the part about Seymour, the mother says this about Seymour. "Call me the instant he does or says anything at all funny. You know what I mean. Do you hear me? Mother, I'm not afraid of Seymour." So this is a declaration. It's one of the only very clear declarations that we have right at the beginning that, in fact, throws into relief all of the communication that does not, in fact, work. But so you have this idea right at the very end of not being afraid of him, and it sort of solidifies our sense that she is, in lots of ways, devoted to her husband. Before we move on, I want to just touch briefly on the importance of this lack of communication, the so what. So as we are noticing different things about literature, it's very good to notice something like a lack of communication, but it's even better to then take it one step further. So what is it that Salinger is doing in all three of these pieces, in A Perfect Day for Bananafish, later in Franny, and later in Zooey? All of this emphasis on failed communication. What is happening there? What is he doing with it? I would argue that there are a few things happening. One is he's just talking about the inefficacy of language. Language is always breaking down. It's one of the only ways that we have to communicate as human beings, but it is something that is very ineffectual when we're really faced with communicating important issues. Language also totally fails in the kind of spiritual and religious realms. A lot of Salinger has to do with this kind of spiritual quest, and it's very difficult to talk about these things in kind of terrestrial language. You know, he's including in the later work a lot of different languages. We have some Sanskrit, we have some Pali, which I don't even know the difference, but apparently that's an important difference. So we have this idea of language as being not very effective when we are talking about spiritual matters. We also have this sense that it's very difficult to process things. It's very difficult to put things into words. Because of that, it is very difficult, in fact, to be known by another person. In Franny and Zooey, especially in Zooey, all of them, of the mother and of Zooey and of Franny, and even with Franny and Lane, especially with Franny and Lane, they're not ever going to fully understand each other, largely because the communication keeps failing. The last thing I will say about this is this idea of interruption. So people are constantly interrupting. Part of that is just, this incredible dialogue that Salinger is offering up, but also this idea of interruption and as things being truncated and cut off. I think it is important to think of that in terms of Seymour's life as being cut off. So if you think of someone's life as as an ongoing conversation and an ongoing verbal expression, Seymour's words are cut off. At one point later in Zooey, Franny says, "I want to talk to Seymour." It's just an absolutely heartbreaking moment in that story. That's kind of like the ultimate interruption. And in fact, the fact that he took his own life is this kind of self-interruption and this kind of, he is ending the conversation effectively. So a lot of the interruptions that are happening syntactically and in conversation, I would argue, are meant to underscore the way that his life is interrupted. I want to touch briefly on the relationship between Muriel and Seymour. You get the sense that they're not communicating very well, but you also get the sense that the foundation of their relationship is there. They have some sort of joking that they do together. They have some sort of intimacy, but you have to really look somewhat carefully to see all of this. I want to look very briefly at a couple of times where we see Muriel's affection for Seymour. A lot of it is reported, but it's important to try to get as full a picture of their relationship as we can. And lots of them also have to do with yet more failure of communication with the mother. So she says, "I said he drove down very nicely, Mother. Now please, I asked him to stay close to the white line and all, and he knew what I meant, and he did." We have this idea that she can communicate things with him. In this case, she is asking him to drive carefully because of some information that is only unfolding here. It's a little cryptic in the beginning, but it begins to come clear that, in fact, Seymour has talked about, an urge to drive the car into trees. So we do get this sense of some sort of suicidal thoughts that he is having, and in fact, that he has expressed to people. So one of the things I love about this story is a lot of the information is meted out in these very interesting and sort of subtle ways. You don't find out until well into the thing, and only because of what Muriel and her mother are saying to each other, that Seymour is really struggling. They talk about something funny with the trees, which you then piece together as this urge to drive the car into the trees. We also know that he has had some sort of small accident with the car. We know that he had some sort of interaction with Muriel's grandmother about death, and he did something to some pictures in Bermuda. So you have the sense of him as acting in ways that speak to some sort of mental crisis. Then we have the presence of this doctor who says, in fact, that he might completely lose control. And at that point, we realize that the family thinks he has been discharged from the army too early. So what's slowly being meted out is this information about how much Seymour is struggling. And then along with that is this idea that he is struggling because of his time in the war. It's important, again, to realize that this is a story that came out in 1948. So everyone would have had this context. Everyone would have understood, why maybe the hotel isn't running perfectly and why the phones are congested. There are lots of sort of references to this post-war world. It's so immediately following the war in lots of ways. So it's very cool the way that this conversation between mother and daughter is very intimate and very sort of shorthandy, and yet we are learning all of this important information. So along with the information is this idea that his nickname for her, his new nickname, is Miss Spiritual Tramp of 1948. I'm back around to the beginning. So you could think that that's not great. A tramp in this case, there's a certain, notion of a promiscuous woman. There's also the idea of just someone who is itinerant. But you have this idea of a spiritual tramp. So he's clearly, he's wanting to introduce her to poetry. And we know there's a certain amount of spiritual curiosity for him. But it's very important, too, that Muriel says he calls her that and then she giggles. So lots of these things feel like kind of inside jokes. Later, she says that he won't take his bathrobe off on the beach because he doesn't want anyone looking at his tattoos. And he has not, in fact, gotten any tattoos, but she is very amused by this. So you get the sense, you can imagine them joking about his tattoos, and she's thinking this is funny. I mean, this is only my interpretation. I suppose some people might think that, Muriel, hates him or something. But my sense is that she is, in fact, very fond of him, and that they may not be having a great sex life, but in fact, they are able to joke about things and they are able to communicate, and they have acknowledged, at least to some extent, his struggles. We're now going to move on to the second chunk of the story. So importantly, we only see Muriel in the first half. We only see Seymour in the second half. So you have them as being very distinctly separated, although they're nicely connected in some ways. So we're going to dive into the second part. Seymour Glass, said Sybil Carpenter, who was staying at the hotel with her mother. Did you see more glass? What you can't see right now is that it's written out like C-S-E-E and then more, M-O-R-E, glass. So this idea of, seeing a larger amount of glass. Pussycat, stop saying that. It's driving Mommy absolutely crazy. Hold still, please. So again, we have a lack of communication. Mrs. Carpenter was putting suntan oil on Sybil's shoulders, spreading it down over the delicate, wing-like blades of her back. Sybil was sitting insecurely on a huge inflated beach ball, facing the ocean. She was wearing a canary yellow two-piece bathing suit, one piece of which she would not actually be needing for another 9 or 10 years. So this first paragraph is giving us so much important information. First of all, Sybil is kind of an ancient woman who is very crone-like and who can speak the truth and who can make prophecies. So this is a young girl, which is this very typical Salingerian kind of cult of youth thing. This idea that children, because they have been uncorrupted by experience in society, it's very Rousseauian, are closer to God and they're closer to truth and they're much more enlightened. So, we have Phoebe in Catcher in the Rye, and here we have Sybil in one of the short stories here, which is not a short story that I love. We have a little guy named Teddy who is apparently this totally, enlightened Buddhist boy. So the youth are very important. We also here have Sybil. Her last name is Carpenter. So they're waiting for her father to arrive. We're not going to talk too much about the patriarchy, but it is important that the fathers are largely absent from these stories. Muriel's father is only kind of in the wings. They're not actually talking. And in fact, a lot of what he says is being reported by the mother, and Muriel interrupts that. We also have this idea of her wing-like shoulder blades. So I think we are meant in some ways to read her as kind of an angelic kind of thing, again, sort of associated with religions and spirituality. It's important here that she is sitting on this huge inflated beach ball. Later, when she is with Seymour, she is on his float that is also inflatable, but it does not have enough air. And he says it doesn't have enough air in it. So we have this idea of sitting insecurely. So this is a child who is insecure when she is with her mother, and when she is with Seymour out in the ocean, you do have quite a bit of trepidation about what is happening with them on this not fully inflated raft out in the ocean with them. So then we get to kind of a gross part. So this idea of her wearing the two-piece swimsuit and she doesn't need, one piece of it for 10 years. Sometimes his, cult of youth thing shades toward gross older man admiring young girl thing. There are a couple of different ways we can read this. One is in like a gross Lolita kind of way, which is really repugnant. But I also think there's another way to read this, and not just because I want to read it this way. I think there is, in fact, data in this story to back this assertion, which is that Seymour is someone who is really suffering after his time in the war. So in some ways, when he's doing these things with Sybil that seem a little bit flirty, and when our narrator is seeming a little bit flirty, my contention is that these are kind of safe places for him to make these kind of romantic comments. At one point, it sounds like Sybil is jealous of Sharon. Sharon Lipschitz has come and sat next to Seymour on the piano bench the night before, and Seymour says, I like you better than I like her, which again, cringy and gross. But I will also argue that my sense is that we aren't meant to read this as like a gross, like lecherous Lolita type thing. We are meant to read this more as this idea that he cannot connect with his wife. He can connect in a cerebral way with these young people, and he can feel enlightenment with them, but we don't really have the sense that there's any kind of gross sexual overtones. I mean, the overtones are definitely there. I really feel like I'm on thin ice. Unfortunately, we also have the fact that her mother is calling her pussy. I actually had to look up and make sure that pussy has always meant vagina, and in fact it has. So you have this kind of gross, like, sexualizing of this young girl of the mother. So we have this kind of weird triple thing where Salinger is, dreaming up a narrator who is maybe Buddy Glass, who is reporting this conversation that Seymour is having with this young girl that has sexual overtones. They're very cringy. I wrote a couple of like ew in the margins here, but I do also think that the bulk of the story and sort of the main idea here is not his connection with her in any kind of romantic or sexualized or gross terrible way, but more as a kind of very chaste stand-in because he's not really able to be close with his wife. And then we have Sybil. She's set loose after her mom says, I'll come back. I'm going to go have some martinis and I'll come back and I'll bring you the olive. Different era, 1948. And then we have finally the introduction of Seymour. This is also one of the tense things. She walks a quarter of a mile, which I was like, oh my gosh, that's really actually far for a little girl to wander away. We also find out at one point that she's much younger than she seems, which is fitting because, in fact, everyone in Salinger is precocious. But she's Sharon Lipschitz, who is like her rival, is only 3.5. So we have this idea of Sybil as actually being younger. I pictured her like 8 or 9, but I think she's more like 4 or 5. So this is our first introduction to Seymour. She walked about a quarter of a mile and then suddenly broke into an oblique run up the soft part of the beach. She stopped short when she reached the place where a young man was lying on his back. "Are you going in the water, Seymour Glass?" she asked. It's still written out Seymour Glass. The young man started, his right hand going over the lapels of his terry cloth robe. He turned over on his stomach, letting a sausaged towel fall away from his eyes, and squinted up at Sybil. "Hey, hello, Sybil." So I just want to spend one quick moment on this introduction to Seymour. First of all, he started, so he's touchy, he's like tense, and when she says his name, "Are you going in the water?" He is in fact a little shaken by this. His right hand, which is the hand of action or the hand of organized religion, according to my new research about Zen Buddhist left and right paths, his right hand goes over the lapels of his terry cloth robe. So we have the idea of this hand as going over his heart. So it's very like, your right hand would come up over your heart. It's also the Pledge of Allegiance, but I think we're more meant to see it as like a protective thing over his heart. He turned over on his stomach, letting a sausage towel roll away from his eyes. So what we have there, I think we can read the sausage towel potentially as a phallic symbol. So he has it over his eyes. You can read this as sort of a substitute for sexuality, and it is falling away. It's also very important that he has the towel fall away from his eyes. So the idea of something falling away from your eyes, maybe, it did this for me, should evoke that idea of scales falling from someone's eyes. So that is a biblical thing. It is about Paul. Is it Paul? Yes, it's about the Apostle Paul and when he is when he first truly embraces his Christianity. So the original idea of scales falling from his eyes is that religious conversion that is very important in the Bible. As one of the apostles, we're talking about a Jesus figure. But it has also gotten to be just this more colloquial meaning, which is to see things clearly. So we here have this other idea of him as seeing things clearly. He is also squinting up at Sybil. So you have this idea of he's kind of lost in his own world. And then when he is brought back to Earth by this child, he's having to sort of squint at her. And before we move away from this first paragraph, I want to touch briefly on the name Seymour Glass. So Sybil, who is this person who, tells truths, the way that she is thinking of Seymour Glass, if you were a child and you heard that phrase, Seymour Glass, it would sound, in fact, like seeing larger amounts of glass. And she is helping the reader to understand, in fact, that we are meant to look at Seymour's name as someone who sees more. So there are a few things here. He sees more in the sense that he is more sensitive, he is more intuitive. He also sees more in the sense that he has seen some horrific things in the war. But we also have this idea of Seymour Glass. And I would argue that that's another one of these kind of cones. It's difficult to see glass. I mean, the whole point of glass is that it is transparent. We can look through it and see things. So it's very difficult to see glass. We also think of glass as being fragile. At one point earlier, there's an instance with windows. And so we have this idea of broken glass. So we have this idea of he himself as being glass and being broken. So I think it's very important to have in our minds. We're going to move fairly quickly through the last part of the story. So they're going to go down to the water together. Anytime people in stories are bathing, certainly if they're getting into the ocean, you should think of baptism, you should think of renewal, you should think of healing. When they move down toward the water, Seymour uses his left hand to take hold of Sybil's hand. So you have this idea, again, of this left hand and this left hand path, the idea towards spirituality. Then a lot of their conversation is nonsensical. And I think a lot of it can be read as, again, that kind of cone-like stuff. She asks him if he likes wax, and they talk about chewing candles. So you have this idea, in some ways, he is not being truthful with her, and he's sort of playing along with these different questions that she is asking. But also you have this sense of him as really paying attention and sort of giving her what it is that she wants. When she asks Seymour if he likes Sharon Lipschitz, he then does this thing where he basically says, well, what I do like about Sharon is she's never mean to little dogs. And then he talks about having seen a little girl being mean to a dog in the lobby of their hotel, and you fully understand that, in fact, it is Sybil. So the reason why that interlude is important is because in lots of ways, Seymour is going to become this kind of Christ-like figure for the Glass family. And one of the ways we see that is that here he's sort of asking her to do certain things and to see the world with compassion and to act in ways that are sort of Christian. And so you have this sense here when we are seeing him in this very first short story, the idea of him being sort of this guiding character. We know that he is about to end his life. His actual death is not, a martyrous kind of death, but you do have the sense of him having been damaged, somewhat beyond repair by his experience in the army, which is in fact a kind of martyrdom, the idea of fighting, for your country and for freedom. So you have this idea of him as this kind of Christ-like figure when we very first meet him in 1948. Then we move on to his description of Bananafish. He says at one point it's a perfect day for Bananafish, and she doesn't know what they are. And she says, "I don't see any," Sybil said. "That's understandable. Their habits are very peculiar. Very peculiar." He kept pushing the float. The water was not quite up to his chest. "They lead a very tragic life," he said. "You know what they do, Sybil?" She shook her head. "Well, they swim into a hole where there's lots of bananas. They're very ordinary-looking fish when they swim in, but once they get in, they behave like pigs. Why, I've known some banana fish to swim into a banana hole and eat as many as 78 bananas." He edged the float and its passenger a foot closer to the horizon. "Naturally, after that, they're so fat they can't get out of the hole again, can't fit through the door." "Not too far out," Sybil said. "What happens to them?" "What happens to who?" "The banana fish." "Oh, you mean after they eat so many bananas they can't get out of the banana hole?" "Yes," said Sybil. "Well, I hate to tell you, Sybil, they die." So I think we can absolutely read this as a somewhat extended metaphor for his experience in the war. He enters into this hole of the war, and he behaves like a pig there. And this idea of consuming lives, again, we have a very precise number that kind of echoes the number, the 50 whatever businessmen who were in the hotel. But we have this idea here of entering into this place and then not being able to get back out. And it is so sad because in the end here, you sort of don't expect it, but he says, well, I hate to tell you, Sybil, they die. So this is one of the very few, instances of very clear, very direct communication. It also is sort of extra sad because there's an earlier time when Muriel is talking to her mother and her mother's worried about something, and Muriel says, I'll live. And it's a very kind of throwaway line on her part, but in a story that is so short and with prose that is so spare, that like, I'll live, and then this they die, these kind of very short declarative sentences are really not that common and should in fact be, very resonant for you. And you have this idea of Muriel as going on to live, and in fact Seymour as dying. I think there's also a way that you can read the banana as a phallic symbol, of course, and this idea of a banana fish. I mean, it's this idea that fishes don't have anything to do with bananas. You can read this as Seymour, not sexually gorging himself, but being somewhat impotent, like having all of these bananas, and yet, they're not penises, they're bananas. Like essentially all of this is not useful for him. We're now going to finish up the story. It is so sad. Prepare yourselves. So they're out in the ocean and they're sort of, wrapping up their time of her sort of cresting all of these waves with his help. And you have him kissing the sole of her foot. So you have this idea of being humble, but you also have this idea of a kiss as being both devotional, but also as a betrayal in some ways. You get the sense that he is going to betray her. And in fact, in some ways you can see that as happening by the fact that he takes his own life. So he says this, "We're going in now. You had enough?" "No." "Sorry," he said, and pushed the float toward the shore until Sybil got off it. He carried it the rest of the way. "Goodbye," said Sybil, and ran without regret in the direction of the hotel. That's not the ending of the story, by the way, but that is so sad. So this idea of without regret, this is one of the things that we talked about in the Franny section. This idea of this almost kind of double negative idea. Regret is something, you're sad that you missed out on something or that you are going to. In this case, she is without regret. The assumption here is that she should, in fact, regret leaving him. And it is interesting to think about Sybil. She's going to never see him again and really not know what happened to him. And it is not going to affect her life in this dire way, which is really speaking to the fact that, we have interactions with people and we have no idea, the pain that they are in and then the sort of difficulties that they will run into. There's a space break and then we have this. The young man put on his robe, closed the lapels tight, and jammed his towel into the pocket. He picked up the slimy, wet, cumbersome float and put it under his arm. He plodded alone through the soft, hot sand toward the hotel. So this idea of the young man is very important because immediately, as soon as young Sybil is gone, we have this narrator again referring to him as the young man, which distances us from him. So he's not Seymour Glass. He is, in fact, the young man. Again, we are emphasizing the fact that he is young. It's also kind of a contradiction in terms, the young man. I mean, it's not, but like a man is not necessarily young. So you have this kind of, again, this kind of cone-like mysterious idea. We also have the float as running out of air, and it's cumbersome. In some ways, I think you can read that as himself. He is someone who needs more air. He is slimy and cumbersome and not sort of feeling very well. So I think we can read this as his life. He's plodding, which speaks to his mental state, of course, and he is plodding alone, and he is moving, in fact, through this kind of desert, this soft, hot sand toward the hotel. And then in this kind of moment of paranoia and sort of misanthropy, we have him accusing this woman in the elevator of looking at his feet. And he says, and she is sort of flustered by this accusation. He's really actually very worked up about the idea that she might be looking at his feet, which, again, you really should, I think, be reading all of this as battle fatigue or post-traumatic stress. So this is the very last couple of paragraphs. He's in the elevator and the woman has exited. "I have 2 normal feet and I can't see the slightest goddamn reason why anybody should stare at them," said the young man. And a little further down, he got off at the 5th floor, walked down the hall, and let himself into 507. Here again, we have the kind of stage direction stuff that we have in Franny, this distance narrator that's just reporting simple actions. The room smelled of new calfskin luggage and nail lacquer remover. So the idea of new luggage, this idea of a beginning an adventure, and also of calf, I mean, it's young. You have this idea of something that has met its death when it is young. So we have the calfskin luggage, the nail lacquer remover. He glanced at the girl lying asleep on one of the twin beds. Then he went over to one of the pieces of luggage, opened it, and from under a pile of shorts and undershirts, he took out an Ortges caliber 7.65 automatic. So that kind of description leads us to believe that Seymour really knows his way around guns, as does the narrator. He released the magazine, looked at it, then reinserted it. He cocked the piece. Then he went over and sat down on the unoccupied twin bed, looked at the girl, aimed the pistol, and fired a bullet through his right temple. Oof, ugh. Really. But what we, honestly, as I am reading through, there's this, like, in every single sentence, there is more that I could say, but I am just going to leave it at that, with that very, very dark ending. So we are going to talk in the next installment about the importance of this story for both Franny and Zooey. But I also will say that all of the stories in 9 Stories, that's not totally true. I do not think that they are uniformly great, but there are some really good stories. One of my favorites is For Esme with Love and Squalor. I love Down by the Dinghy. I really love Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut, which is in fact about one of the other Glass children. So I hope that this deep dive today into A Perfect Day for Bananafish has not only helped you think a little bit more about Franny and has prepared you to think about Zooey and Franny and Zooey together, but also has just even further deepened your appreciation for this short story, but also for the mastery of Salinger. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.